The 19th century was the last century of realpolitik, which is a term that means the politics of realism. It infers a hard-headed pragmatism that what's good and what's moral doesn't come into the political calculus. Rather, the purpose of the state is to protect itself and to expand its power. Whether those means happen to be through diplomacy or war depends on the circumstances and the goals trying to be achieved. This is a very famous period in human history, often called the Iron and Blood period. The title comes from a very famous quote by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who said, "Not by speeches and votes of the majority are the greatest questions of our time decided, but by iron and blood." There's no question that Otto von Bismarck was right in his assertion. In fact, Europe spent so much iron and blood trying to resolve the great questions of their time that eventually Europe had no more iron and no more blood to spare, because it had all been spent during World War I. World War I shattered the Iron and Blood period and the period of realpolitik, at least of naked realpolitik. Because you will talk to people today who make very good arguments that we are still living in a world of realpolitik, just that our leaders aren't saying it openly. I don't subscribe to that particular view, but I think it's very legitimate. Regardless, though, because of the horrific nature of World War I and the amount of men and money spent trying to achieve victory, the war had to be for something greater than just territorial gain. It needed to be a war for freedom, for democracy, for the independence of nations. Some of those things happened, and some did not. But what it did do is ensure that people would fight and strive for more than just king and country. It opened the door for ideology. Before you know it, competing ideologies were springing up left, right, and center. And this sets the stage for what I believe to be the first true ideological conflict, World War II. After all, you had these three different ideologies. Liberal democracy, represented by the United Kingdom, the United States, and the West. You had fascism, represented by Germany and Italy. And then, of course, you had communism, represented by the Soviet Union. World War II knocked out the fascists, and subsequently, the Cold War knocked out the communists. Apparently, when it comes to ideologies, there can only be one. But even though now we live in an era with one dominant overarching ideology, sort of this liberal democracy with neoliberal economic policies, ideology still drives our politics more than any other force, I submit. We read a question from Jake last week in which he lamented the lack of ideology in politics. I disagree slightly with him because I do believe we are still extremely ideological, as politics aren't driven by generals and armies as they were in ancient Rome, or by family and cultural ties as they are in India. Don't get me wrong, though. Knowing someone and having great connections is certainly a leg up in Western politics. But it does not guarantee victory, and it isn't the end-all be-all factor, as we see politicians with stellar connections fall all the time and unknown quantities rise up from seemingly nowhere. What we should be doing, though, is lamenting the lack of diversity in terms of ideology. And that's where I 100% agree with Jake, and that's why Jeremy Corbyn is such a breath of fresh air. Because he throws a wrench into this one ideology to rule them all sort of mentality. Specifically, Jeremy targets that neoliberal economic ideology. Jeremy, coming from a time before Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the two main figureheads who ushered in this era of neoliberal economics, which are defined by unfettered capitalistic ideologies, such as free trade, union busting, and economic deregulation. Jeremy, on the other hand, has an entirely different economic worldview. He's not defined by unfettered capitalism, free trade, and complete deregulation. Whether you agree with Jeremy or disagree with him, you have to concede he's bringing forth an ideology which hasn't been seen in quite some time, and that only helps broaden our horizons.